If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button as well as the bell to be notified of future videos. Thank you.
Hello Internet, we are back, and I have to apologize to you. I've got some sort of a flu, might even be the dreaded disease, which name we cannot mention here, I'll be banned. So I'm at home, and we're still recording, so it looks a bit different computers. If my voice sounds strange to you, I apologize, nothing I can do. We have Arnè Söderlund here. Admiral, you're very welcome. Grateful for you. Thank you for coming back. I know there's a few questions you want to answer about the last one. I know one of them was that it wasn't only officers who went to Israel, it was also other ranks, I suppose. And then we will talk about operations, or you will, because I'm not talking a lot today. And I'm sure there's a lot of people saying, thank God. So I'm just going to sit here.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. And thank you again for this opportunity. Thank you to all those who made comments. Sorry, but I'm not technically qualified to reply. Apparently, it just jumps to a YouTube program. I think I might have misled them a little bit by concentrating on what I was doing across there and my group of people, which were the officers. But there was one question about whether only the officers brought them back. Who were the sailors that brought the ships back? Well, I can tell you that every single man on every ship was a South African. In fact, over the 3-year period, we had between 180 and 200 South African sailors were across in Israel. A number of them, mainly the officers, senior officers, technical warrant officers, and technicians, spent 2 years or more. We all did technical courses, and we all got a lot of specialization. We wrote all the documentation. But after we'd started, and they came in 3 groups, each boat, although some of us linked up. And later we got the sergeants, the lower level operators, etc., or technicians even as well, who were the operators more. And they came along for about a year. And before we commissioned the ships, all the rest of the operators, the juniors, down to the chefs, every single man came across to Israel. They came unaccompanied, of course, and they did very basic courses. They did the task book, and a lot of them got attachments as well. All the senior chaps got attachments. They got attachments, and then they also stood by, and in fact, as they arrived, we were giving them courses in the shipyard itself and taking them over the boats, so that when we sailed for the first sea trials, they knew everything on board, because we actually occupied the ships before we commissioned them. And once again, the training was done on our own ships there. So every man that worked there came back. Also, just to give you an idea, 60 of the staff members were married. So 60 apartments were provided for us in Israel. So there was no use of any other nationalities on board. South Africans did it completely. I hope that answers the question that I had in the commentary.
But now I have one with my horrible voice. You kept operational secrecy for all that time. I'm really impressed.
Well, it was a requirement, and everybody was well aware that it could cost them. In fact, anyone who was suspected of discussing things was called in and threatened to be sent home. We did send, in fact, one person who did get sent home, not necessarily for that, but it was a very strict. The whole organization was run by Captain Arnè, who was a very, very excellent officer, accounting officer. Some people might not have liked his decisions, but I can just mention one thing. When I was doing staff course, one of the financial people in the Defense Force said that Project Japonica was the best run project in terms of budget he'd ever come across. Everything was approved, everything was controlled. And it helped to be a secret one like this, because it kept us a very close group. So we got through the whole thing very, very well.
So I must ask you, was there any romance between the South Africans, the unmarried ones now, and the Israeli women?
Yes, two of my friends. One, in fact, when he finished, he was a chief petty officer. He had a very narrow escape, an incident with a gun there. When he finished his service back here, he went back and he joined the Israeli Navy and married an Israeli. And then one of my friends, an officer, my oppo on the third boat, met a lady while across there. She's come out of South Africa, and they live in South Africa. And there might have been a few others, but those are ones that were close to me and I'm well aware of.
Now, that's fascinating. So what you're saying to me is these ships were actually operational when you left. When you came down south with them, they could defend themselves.
I wouldn't say but defend themselves. I'd say more they could operate safely at sea. I presume we could have done some. I can't think right now, but I don't think we had any large caliber ammunition. We might have. It's one of those things that has slipped my mind, I'm afraid. But we weren't expecting to have to fight or anything like that. We came back safely and able to run the ships, repair them, maintain them back to South Africa.
I spoke to a female US sailor once. I was quite close to her, and I called the aircraft carrier a boat. She was most upset. So she explained to me very clearly, yes, I had to apologize twice. So I have to ask you, just for in case somebody here, what's the difference between a boat and a ship?
It's a little bit blurry nowadays, but basically the concept is a ship carries a boat. So if you don't carry a boat, you're a boat. So you'll find a submarine, for example, all submarines are referred to as boats because they don't carry other boats. Nowadays, of course, with inflatables, and as you know from our own operations, we carried boats inside. It comes down to the old thing that if you're big enough to carry a second vessel which you can launch, you're a ship.
Yes, she explained that, but with a lot more F's in between. I was quite astonished. I didn't know she knew such language. But from the comments which I read, I see there's a great pride and love between the ship and the people who served upon it. And they call these vessels strange names, like a P number and scratches. And can you tell us a bit about that, please?
Okay, first of all, a ship is a her in the name. We always refer to it as her. The English word for forbiddenness, the linkage between the trip company and the ship is, if you think regimental pride is good, ship pride is even higher because you live on your ship. I don't know of any regimental parade ground that has sunk yet or caught fire. So you love your ship, you look after her, you maintain her, and you put a lot of effort into keeping her happy. So ships are very sentimental to us. The strike craft, before they were formally named, were given P numbers. The P stands for patrol. We initially called them patrol craft, believe it or not. And we all got numbers. It's almost a NATO system, even though we weren't part of NATO, but it's an accepted system, Western system. While we were there, we were doing boat one and their inspections, and because of the continuous telling the shipyard workers to remove something and put it in the right place or put a better one there, as a joke, and I've actually got a photograph of it somewhere, as a joke, I made up 2 name boards for the ship. When she commissioned, she got 2 name boards for patches because everywhere they were re-welding and patching. Even though they left before us, they were very quick to react, and we got the name scratches. And I've actually got one of the name boards in my collection now. The third boat, we'd left as well, and as I pointed out to you, the arms embargo came down just before we commissioned, so she was still quite under a bit of construction. And as a joke, we called her matches because she was going to get everything that we didn't have, and she was going to be made up from parts because we weren't sure they were going to get back. So it was just a joke name, and it did stick. We've got T-shirts wearing them, but it was never used anything other than for camaraderie between ships.
You mentioned of some mountain where there used to be a lot of fish, and the ships would sail out to this.
Mount Vima.
Yes, and Frans Fourie immediately sent me a picture of him holding 2 huge fish. I don't know what they are. He was quite impressed with that, obviously. I haven't shown the picture to you, but I'm sure you perhaps can remember where he got those pictures from.
Yeah, no, it wouldn't be Mount Vima, I don't think, because very few people go there. We just go there once in a while. The fishing fleets of the world know it, and they've fished it almost clear.
I have to ask if a Pongos, as you call the army, the soldiers, it stands for big ape. By the way, I went and I looked it up. That's the dictionary. Yeah, something like a gorilla, overgrown in size. If I would catch the fish, do they have to actually share it with you people?
Not really. On my ship, never, because I'm not particularly keen on fish. I prefer the steak that they've made available to me by eating their fish. Just to interject a little bit, during our earlier talk, you asked this question about fishing, and I said I'd link it to an operation. And it wasn't one of mine, but it's an interesting one. During Operation Trample, which was an operation in which 2 strike craft would go into Maputo Bay, and they actually went and anchored, very light anchorage within the bay, while they waited for the reccees to go ashore. On the one ship, the ship's company went up to the captain, Commander Retief, and asked permission to fish. And he said, "No, I'm afraid not. We cannot risk the chance we get caught by their fisheries people for illegal fishing, and they might impound us." They went away quite happy, but they didn't fish because the main reason was they had to be attentive at all times. You were in the middle of another country's waters, you could not mess around. So we have denied fishing at times.
Well, someone sent me a picture of a Navy submarine, one of these Daphne things, having a barbecue on the deck. I'm not sure if it's even real. It might be. It looks real. Would you allow barbecues on a strike craft? It is a South African thing.
Yes, it's only on certain circumstances. You just take safety precautions. On a submarine, in fact, it's quite easy because there's nothing to burn on the upper casing. If anything catches light, you just dive and hope like hell they've got their life belts on. But it's been done a few times. It's one way of doing this.
Okay, this was fascinating. I wonder if we can go to operations, unless there's anything else you want to tell us about the previous one, because my voice is giving up. I know it's gross.
No, I think we'll move to that now. I just want to mention, though, that I'm going to base it on my own experiences, on my involvement. There were 46 operations. I was only involved in some of the first ones. I can answer questions if people later or in another program would like to ask them, but at this stage, my own experience. When Boat 2 arrived back, we came back to Simonstown and then moved down to Durban. But of the 2 strike craft, there was always 1 in each port. And the 3rd boat came because we apparently only had 1 boat at that stage. When the 3rd boat came, we had 1 at sea in between the 2. So we were doing a round robin each. So we didn't have much time with our families. It was pretty difficult because we were moving into new houses and everything. So it was a very difficult period. But we were then standing by to man our own ships. And the Commander Retief had been doing the manning, was the captain of Boat 4. And so I was, after 6 months, I was brought ashore. So I only had a 6-month period as first lieutenant. And I came ashore and I took over running personnel and manning of the ships. And I was quite happy, before I forget, but after arriving back here, I bumped into a face I knew well from the academy, a Malcolm Kinghorn, who was the officer in charge of C Group, Charlie Group, which was at that stage, the maritime or the seaborne raiders, small group of 12 men under 1 recce. And he came on board and said, "Do you mind if we practice?" Because he was very nautically minded from the academy. I know he took part in a cutter race with the Navy chaps. And he brought his chaps with their rubber boats. And they started exercising, launching them from our ship. We have rollers at the back, which is one way of launching boats. We normally used a derrick rig to pull us up out of the water. And it was taking quite some time. They pushed the boat over the side, almost vertically to go over the edge and down. Then they put the engine in. And I happened to mention to him that when I was in Israel doing the seamanship tasking, I designed a ramp which folded out at the stern. And he asked to see it, and I went and got the drawings I'd made of it. And I'll never forget, because we'd asked the Israelis what it would cost. They were going to charge us something like $2,400 or something, which just seemed a bit too much for us. So he took them away. And the next thing he said, I've got the money. Can you have them made? And our engineering workshop promptly made up one. And we fitted it onto the stern and rolled it out. And it was like a fixed ramp with rollers on it. And the boat would go down and we could launch the boats. And we were doing very well with this. Anyway, I then went ashore, and the next thing we know, 4 recce was established in Langebaan, and I'd forgotten about this. However, towards the end, in about November of 1978, I suddenly got a request. I was called in and told by my captain, who also became Chief of the Navy, Captain Syndicum, that I was to go down and see Boat 2. Captain was waiting for me, which was my old ship. I went down there and I discovered Malcolm Kingan and a few other interesting people there. And I was then sworn to secrecy and told that they were going to be helping some other people do a task, but they needed to launch 2 boats within a very short time. How could we do to the one ramp? And I said, no problem, because we just pick up the boats. And he said, no, not the little boats. We've got the Mark V Zodiacs, which carry a lot of people, and they're very heavy. And we looked at this and we said, we can't do it. It was physically impossible to do it. So they said, okay, we have a problem, because we've got a time zone to launch and get the boats in because of distance. In those days, we were still very nervous. It would appear that we were going to be dropped off. They were going to drop off. So I got the engineer, who was a good friend of ours, Captain Commander Nell, Jack Nell. And he and I had worked on the seamanship. He'd done the engineering side of it. And we went down to I called him down, and the 2 of us stood on the back of the ship. And we got a ramp on the one side, on the starboard side. And we looked, how are we going to get a second boat in? Because we have to make the boat and launch it from a second place. And the one thing we were told is we weren't going to recover them. We were going to launch the boats and then get out. And an idea came to mind. Between the 2 of us, on the back of his Peter Stuyvesant 30s packs of cigarettes, we made a quick drawing. We went back to the office. We sat together, made a drawing, and went back to Malcolm Kingan and said, if you've got 28 rand, we can manufacture one of these for you. We'll be able to launch the boat, but not recover. And it was like a seesaw. So what we did was we had a long frame with 2 wooden struts on it, and we built this so that we put this on the deck. We could hide it. When we came to do the operation, we take it out. So half of it was over the stern and half of it was on board, and it swiveled on a swivel. Then we'd build the boat on top of it, put a lot of soft soap or liquid soap on the boat, and then slowly push it. And as it moved aft, the weight would take it. We had 2 ropes holding it down. As soon as it was down, she'd slide in. They did it overnight, and it was rather fortuitous because the boat we were going in 3 days' time, the operation was taking place. Anyway, I was then told, because of this, that I had to design a method of doing it quickly. So I was seconded to the ship as a seamanship officer for the operation. We haven't had this before, because it was the very first strike craft operation ever. The other problem we had was it was not far up the coast, and we couldn't take the risk because it was air activity. So we had to camouflage everything. With the previous rollers, the frame I had, we just rolled it up. This one we had to hide on the deck, but also had to hide the boat. So we came up with the idea. We got a lot of camouflage nets, which the recce's brought us. And then we got a lot of rags, bags of rags. And the idea was that you tie rags to them and it covers up. And the problem was that's all khaki, so it looks suspicious. So what we had to do is for 2 nights, we sat in a big shed with all the gray paint we could find, and we soaked these in paint. I have never seen so much paint used because the cloth just sucked it in. And we manufactured 2 big camouflage nets, which we hung up to dry there. And the night of the operation, took them out, turned the gun forward, so the gun was like a boom over, and then we spun the nets over. So it was quite an interesting exercise. We, late in November, middle of November, sorry, 1978, we sailed under great secrecy again. Nobody knew where we were going, and went up the coast. Anyway, that night, or just before we left, we got a bunch of people came on board, and it turned out to be Zebra Group, a group of, I remember there were 8 or 10 of the Rhodesian SAS, and under the Phantom Major, Graham Wilson. And we didn't have much to do with them. They all moved aft. I and my team, we then went up the coast, and we slowly started closing. The idea being that we would launch them into Maputo, where they'd carry out their task, which we weren't privy to. They would then come back, but because of the time, they would be picked up by the submarine and they'd sink the boats, which was a fairly good plan. Very expensive boats and brand new as well, because they'd just been bought for this operation. Anyway, that night we went in and we came up to the position, and we could see the lights of LM quite clearly. We're still far out. And we assembled the boats, but the weather was an easterly wind and very, very choppy. We duly brought the boats alongside, we launched them. We then put the scrambling nets over the side, and they climbed down into the boats. 4 recce had 3 members in each boat, 2 or 3, and then the rest were the team, the Zebra Group. Once they were off, we said goodbye, and we opened up and headed back to Durban. Our part had been done. I then went, had a lay down, and at about 1 o'clock in the morning, I got called up by the captain and said, guess what? We're going back. We've got to go and fetch them. So I said, that's going to be interesting, because we can only recover 1 at a time, but it didn't matter at that stage. But it turned out that one of the boats in the pounding going in, she'd loosened a board. It's got boards that interconnect the base of the vessel, and as soon as that happened, she could actually collapse, closing in on herself, and she could not go to the speed, so it was obvious, and the entire operation was called off. I can just mention that was one of the first assassination attempts on Robert Mugabe at that stage. Anyway, what had apparently happened, we were told that the submarine had gone into the bay to collect them, but they decided not to destroy them because they had aborted the operation and they might need them again. And especially old Lieutenant Tafi Jaber, who was the boats officer from 4 recce, who had them on his slop chit. They actually pulled him up onto the submarine, which is something unusual. We hadn't done it before. They pulled these 2 heavy boats up, and she left on the surface the whole way. We should have to leave on the surface normally, but she went out to sea, and we rendezvoused with her. Anyway, we brought the boats alongside with the passengers because we'd take them home too. We got home a lot faster. And then, believe it or not, we actually were able to recover the one on the seesaw, which was interesting because it had never been designed for that. It took a lot of effort and very careful. We had to hold, a bit risky at times, but we realized that this was where the future lay, in a similar type of thing, either which slid back, but concept was good because it gave us a very small angle as well. So we recovered the boats, one of which had been damaged by the submarine's exhausts, and we went back alongside, offloaded the next night, in fact, offloaded the people, all sworn to secrecy, and that was my first operation, my involvement in the design of the actual thing, which was a good value to me. And that was Operation Lark. There was another Lark, it became Lark 1 and Lark 2, and a few more, but I was not aware of what was going on because good secrecy. Though I can just mention that quite often I was, because I was the personnel officer, told, please don't adjust the crew, don't do this, don't do that. And I did not ask questions. I knew there was a good reason for it. Anyway, that was my first operation. And then after that, I had a fairly long break. But what happened is I also had to eventually do my command qualification. And the command qualification is quite strong. You have a board of officers and you do a lot of actual maneuvering at night. You do a lot of exercise. You've got to come alongside so many times. You've got to come stern first. You've got to move in wind. You've got to do replenishment at sea, which is rather interesting. And the worst thing we had was towing approach, which we used the Israeli system, where one boat stopped, the other one came up like this, and they passed it. And we said no, and I was about the last person to do that one because it was very risky in the wind. But we then went to the other approach, which was also Israeli, whereby the ship that is broken down, they developed this if a strike craft breaks down in operation. One stops, and at night they just shine, they've got all darkened, they put buoys over the side or fenders, they shine a torch on them so there's no light source. The other ship comes in and goes to within, they used to go about 10 meters, but we got it down where you didn't even have to use a heaving line, just throw a messenger across. And you basically stopped as you went past, they passed the lines, connected up, and you towed each other out. So this takes a good 6 months to perfect, especially if you haven't done it, because we were quite new and we haven't had very many opportunities. And I duly did my exams and everything. One of the last things that they had to do was you had to do a special forces operation with a qualified ship. So you went on board and you observed the captain, basically. Luckily for me, the particular operation, which was happening, was on boat 62, my old ship. So I duly reported on board, and I was given a bit of a briefing, not much, and we sailed with one of the other ships. Woody Woodburn, in fact, was a CTG. It's his first CTG trip that I'd been on. He was on the other ship, boat 1, the first ship, and we sailed with me as the makey learney. I was to observe and to get my experience. I'd be making decisions and doing things, but captain would be there to watch me. We sailed from Durban into what I can only describe as our worst storm, other than 1 year later when I rescued a ship called the Kaleo. But it was a magnificent storm. Magnificent is from the observer, not from those experiencing it. In fact, it was so bad that the captain, who was a pretty experienced captain, got very, very sick. And he was really looking sick. And we could not even get a doctor. Eventually, I got one of 4 recce at us because the doctors were being sick as well. We actually brought a doctor up. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, he came to see the captain, and we discovered that he actually had, I'm not sure if it was mumps or one of these, quite a serious sickness. And he was man down. This caused a bit of consternation because we were on an operation. Then he basically said, okay, someone's going to have to take over. Now, normally the first lieutenant would take over. He is the second in command. I was a visitor on board. However, the first lieutenant agreed that I'd been the first lieutenant on board, and since I knew a bit more than he did, it was suggested that I'll be there. The captain remains in command, so it was technically. And this was conveyed to the senior ship. They agreed as well, and we decided to continue on. It was also during that storm that a wave broke over and smashed the front of our director. It was a nasty storm. In fact, it was so bad that it delayed our progress. Now, the aim of this particular operation, called Boxer, was also with the Zimbabwe Rhodesian. Up until now, every operation we'd done, the Zimbabwe Rhodesian forces, or the Rhodesian initially, were the raiding party. Our 4 recce were purely the conveyors, the taxi drivers. We were the train drivers, they were the taxi drivers. And in this particular one, we were about to have our first real shot at something. We had 3 teams of Rhodesian SAS, and then we had 1 team of our combat divers. The targets were in the port of Beira, and they were twofold. On the leading ship, boat 1, where the CTG was, the 2 teams there were tasked with going ashore, going into the center of the town, finding the communication center where all the internal telexes, phones, and radio communications were set near the building. And the point is that they were going to blow this building up, take away all the communications. Once they'd done that, they were going to then spring the prisoners in the local jail Many of them were in armor. And the cover, of course, was they were in armor. On my ship, we had a third team of the Rhodesians, and they were going to go to the warehouse in the port itself, where all the armaments for the Rhodesians, Zapu, I think, where the Robert Mugabe's troops, where all their weaponry was stored before being sent up to them. They were going to blow up the warehouses there. The fourth team was a very special team. That consisted of 4 South Africans, the senior, the coxswain, and then 2 divers and a standby diver, Gavin Christie and Potty Potgieter. And they were tasked with blowing up the dry dock. Now, the first thing is the dry dock is where you could repair any ship. After destroying the gate of the dry dock, they were then going to sink 2 of the dredgers. The whole idea being, because the Pungwe River comes down in flood, it has to have the harbor has to be constantly dredged. Any stoppage in the dredging means she'll silt up, and the heavy ships will not come in. It would definitely stop the loading of ammunition, arms and things. We were now being delayed. We were supposed to get in on a Sunday night, but because of this foul weather, we were delayed very, very badly. And we eventually came into good weather, and I went across to the senior ship where the decision had to be made of were we going to go on, were we going to stop, or were we going to postpone for a day. The decision was made. First of all, they ratified that I would run it, because our captain didn't leave his bunk practically. The decision was made, and we then proceeded, and it was a very interesting experience. And I had actually been on an operation before, as I said, on the same ship, so it fitted in very well. And on the night of the operation, the Monday night, we closed the port of Beira, and we had 2 ships we could see, one large ship and one small boat. And as we were approaching, all of a sudden, the smaller boat started flashing Alpha Alpha at us. Now, Alpha Alpha means what ship, where bound. It's a challenge, we call it. We both rigged our lights, but we had no radar. So I'm not sure what they'd seen. Our lights were off. But I was to starboard, and I immediately altered course to try and get the bigger ship between us. And I succeeded. Boat 1 switched on her fishing lights and ambled the other way. It stopped. So the disguise worked for them, and I didn't have to do it. We then launched the boats just off the entrance to the canal, Beira Canal. And the boats then proceeded. We waited. We had nothing to do except wait. And later transpired that when the teams got to the center of town, what should have been a Sunday night and very, very quiet was humming with people. Cinemas, people going into cinemas, there were buses and taxis. And unfortunately, this is me as an amateur, the chap in charge decided to go in a bit early. They were dressed as for the local Frelimo. They marched as a patrol, their black is beautiful, etc. On a street, and they went past the building to recce it, and then 2 guards outside looked at them, and they marched down a street. It turned out to be a dead end. And they got stuck in the street, and the next thing, these 2 guards saw another patrol and said, "Hold it, this patrol gone down there." They came hurtling down towards them, and all of a sudden, the SAS teams were trapped. At that stage, they were carrying a rather interesting weapon. I think it's an M120. It's a .22, it's a silenced .22, but it fires 120 rounds in a few seconds flat. And when this lot came at them, they opened at them with ease. And it would appear that because it didn't make the noise, the patrol kept coming. And in the end, they had to flee. They probably killed a few, but they still had to run and move. So they then started running to get back to the ship. They'd obviously postponed theirs. Whereas down at the harbor, the diving team had now gone in. and they'd gone and placed their mines on the gate of the dry dock. And as they were swimming away, they just got around the corner, the mines detonated. Our first experience of one of these. It was quite traumatic, not dramatic, traumatic. And they in fact got disorientated. One of the other boats, when they surfaced, one of the other boats picked them up and delivered them back to their boat. And what is amazing is they decided to continue. Now, I don't know about you, but if I had a mine go off just after it activated, I wasn't going to put any more mines up. However, they went and the two dredges, they went up to the two dredges, the Pungwi and the Matola, and they placed 2 mines on each before withdrawing. In the meantime, with the chaos of the withdrawal from the center of town, the team in the warehouse was only supposed to start its detonations once the others were in place. So the SAS came away with nothing. And in fact, while we were departing, we could hear the explosions, and both the 2 dredges were sunk. So it was the first time in which we'd done a maritime special forces operation, and we'd done it very successfully. I did mark that these 2 guys deserved a medal, and they duly did. I'm not saying I gave it to them, but I thought they deserve it, and they both got the Honoris Crux. The funny thing was, though, that it would appear that the detonation was one of 2 reasons. Apparently, they'd been dropped on the ship and would normally be ditched. This is one theory we had, which activated it. The other one was that they broke the timer, because the problem was that this was hinged at the bottom. That was unknown to us. The 2 divers had to go down deeper than their breathing apparatus, because they had oxygen regenerators. And you're very careful if you go too deep. And they had to go deep, so they were a little bit quick with that tape. But either ways, they blew in the gates and they sank both of the 2 dredges. So that was a very successful operation, and it was quite an experience. And I know that after I finished that one, I felt a lot more confident than I'd ever felt about my own command. In March, I took command of Oswald. It was the 6th, the last of the original Japonica boats. She had a bit of a funny experience, because while I was doing things like this operation, our first lieutenant was taken out for trials, and on one trial she came back without one of her propellers. It dropped off. So it delayed us a little bit, but in March we commissioned, and it was a perfect time to commission, because shortly after that I took part with 3 other strike craft in the first missile firing. Commander Retief once again in boat 4 fired a missile and sank the hull destroyer Jan van Riebeck. The boat 3 or 5, I'm not sure which it was with him. And boat 1 and boat 6 had a fascinating job, which was quite safe. But we both sailed towards each other about 5 miles beyond the target. And as that fired, we were directly behind the target, and it opened up. It was to see how it attracted the missile, and also to see if we could pick up the missile coming in. I'm not sure the distance, it wasn't quite 5 miles, it was a lot less. We were pretty close. But it was a very good exercise, very successful. We eventually sank the JVR. So it was a good time. Shortly after that, in August of 1980, once again, I got called in, and Commander Rennie with boat 5. He was actually initially the OC of boat 3, but when her OC designate resigned to go to the shipyard, we closed his boat. We didn't have crew, moved him across to boat 5. The 2 of us were called in, and we were told we were going to take part in an operation on the West Coast. Up until now, we've done nothing on the West Coast. It was in Namib, and we were given the details. The 2 of us were given the details. What happened is what they were looking at. The idea at that time, if I remember correctly, was they were going to destroy all the fuel tanks in the harbour terminal and in the new terminal, which was being developed. Plus, they were going to take out the cement factory, which was above the newer terminal. The reason being was that this was the source of the southern fuel on the southern front. Namib was the fuel refueling port. If you know Angola, all the railway lines go inland. There's nothing north and south. The only north-south section is between Benguela and Lobito, and that's just a line. So anything to go by rail had to be loaded at one of those ports to go out to our area. We then basically went through to do the briefing, the workup. Boat 5 and boat 6 went through to Longabaan, where we did a very extensive workout. And while there, we were given the results, and we were told the targets would now be cement factory. Just had too much equipment there to try and carry all the explosives to take out all the machinery. But they discovered that it had its own fuel storage. So the third target now became the fuel tanks at the cement factory. The Jack Rief, Samfari, and I can't remember who the third chap was, had done the recce. They'd done an excellent recce from a submarine. And so the briefings were very, very good. It is hard to believe that we could get so much intelligence from a small team like that. At that stage, we were still using the rubber boats, but we now had an advanced, I say advanced, it was a steel frame that slid out a bit. And we lifted it up, and we actually didn't have to pull the boats up by boat. We had a little Land Rover winch on it, which you could pull the boats up. But we did the workup, and then we departed for Namib. And you've heard, I think both, I think France was there, but I know SW was there. It was an amazing exercise, operation. We went in on the night on D-Day, went up, stayed 5 miles off the coast. It's a safe area. Because there's coastal traffic, a lot of fishing boats as well. We launched the boats. They penetrated successfully, and it was very, very quiet. There was very little going on. A lot of fishing boats around there. And we were getting the reports back. I was getting just a few of them repeated to us because I was the junior ship. And then we were told the boats were on their way back. And that was, we knew the timings, etc. So we knew they were cutting it a little bit fine. And some of the boats were a bit delayed. In fact, my boats hadn't quite arrived back yet. I was up on the bridge looking for them. I could see the others going across, when all of a sudden there was a massive explosion and what looked like a volcano. That was the fuel tank at the cement factory going up. It was the first one to be blown. And the fuel was just running down the hill like lava. It was quite fascinating. And that was almost like the start of Guy Fawkes, because after that, it just started popping everywhere. But the most amazing sight was when the gas tanks went off, because it was low cloud, the flames and the thing just went straight up. And all of a sudden, I could look around and I could see my fellow strike craft to my right-hand side, bright as day. Chaps in the boats, when they came back and said, "Yes, we could see you perfectly," because the cloud base was like a massive reflector. And as the tanks started going off, we lost count. They were just popping all over. You could actually watch them. You could see that's in the woods. That's where they were. And we lost a bit of interest in it because all of a sudden we realized just how visible we were. At the same time, of course, every ship in the harbor that could was trying to get out. That was the worrying thing, because we were in their way. Not in their way, but we could be in their way. And we were very, very visible. If anybody had used a pair of binoculars and looked out there, we would have been riggers. However, it didn't work out like that. And I think SW also mentioned, we heard it. Chaps screaming for help and to come and let his ropes loose. It was a lot of tragedy that night. My boats were a bit late, but by the time I got my fellow strike craft was heading for sea, and I was following as fast as I could. It turned out to be a very, very successful raid, and I think it's one of the most successful raids we've ever done, not just special forces, that's without a question, but also in the Defence Force. I'll say that for a number of reasons. First of all, the whole aim of this was not to be seen, to destroy the fuel and the cement factory tanks. Initially, it was a cement factory. It was amended to the tanks. We were not to be seen. We were to attribute it to UNITA, and that was a requirement. In the end, not only did we achieve everything, but it turned out that when the fuel tank went up at the cement factory, people ran and they left their machinery on, and the machinery burnt out. On top of it, when the tanks went off in the town, the old jetty in the harbor, they brought in their fire brigade, and sadly, a lot of them died in that fire, and also it took out a prison. So there were supplementary targets. And the thing that I found fascinating was that when I did my research for the book, it turns out that even the CIA believed it was UNITA. So it hit every single mark that we wanted. And I have no doubt that that was the most successful. Jack Creoff, in his book, A Greater Share of Valor, has made the same statement. I agree with him fully. That was a lovely. However, on the way back, we started hitting foul weather. And I was a little bit astern, so I think maybe that didn't help either. And on our way, in our pounding, one of my hatches sprang open and the wave knocked backwards. So it was water pouring into the forward part of the ship. So we had to turn around. We had to, it was all buckled, but eventually we winched it down and tried to seal it with various things, and we made it reasonably safe. We pumped the water out. And as we started heading south again, I got told by my one doctor that we have a very, very serious patient, which was his fellow doctor, second doctor. And I don't know if it was a hernia from retching or something, but he said, we've got to have to land him. And we were not supposed to be going into Walvis Bay, but we detoured and we landed him outside Walvis Bay without being seen. And he was then rushed to hospital. And once again, the support in his operations. He was landed, ambulance aircraft. It was in, before we even got south of the border, he was already in 1 mile in Pretoria. We then continued south, where we quickly nipped into Donkergat. We offloaded the equipment, and we then made, by the time I got there, my sister ship had continued. Her point is her staying with me. We were in a safe area. She continued on. She'd also taken weather damage. She got into Simonstown quickly to get it repaired that morning. I followed, and we got in the late evening. And I think I mentioned that that's where the OC of the dockyard, Peter Gerard, was there. Granted, we had no equipment on board, all my sailors, so it shouldn't have been too much a giveaway, but he was very attentive. They cast cement, they sealed up everything, and then they told us we could proceed. We rushed for home. And just on a point of interest, my first lieutenant was a fairly go-ahead lieutenant commander. He had been there since I'd been his first lieutenant, and on the boat too. And we decided we were going to try and look at the record for the trip up the coast. And we decided we were going to go within the current, that one of us would be on duty all the time with one of the sub-lieutenants. And as we left harbor, we went up to maximum revs. Engineer had to decide how much he could give us. And when we arrived off Durban, we could see our fellow chap doing his lineup. We slowed down and came in and followed him into harbor. It was just a lovely feeling coming back together. So that was my next experience. First operation on the West Coast, very successful one. I don't know if you've got any questions on those two so far, or you want me to just continue?
Yes, I actually have two questions, if you don't mind. I often wondered what the special forces people look like when they board your ship. So I can understand if you pick them up at Donkergat or wherever, fine, there's no one there. But surely, sir, from a security viewpoint, if you pick up special forces guys dressed like Renamo in Durban Harbour, that can be a problem.
No, they come down to the ship. First of all, when we take them on board, in Durban we've taken them on board in Richards Bay as well. But first of all, it's done after hours at night. They come in covered vehicles, and they don't come. We also have the area secluded, but they don't come across in their normal uniforms. They come across in a more basic uniform, because once they're at sea, it's a long time. They spend most of the time on board in PT shorts and vests. For them, it's a relaxing period. I say relaxing. It's not very comfortable. I mean, the submarines are terrible for them, but on strike craft, they do hot bunk as well. They used to use our magazine with our guns down aft as a place to sleep, but it was just as good as sleeping in the veld anyway. At least they had hot coffee and eggs for breakfast. They got very good food, I can tell you that.
They said that to me. I remember that RSM James Tytger was also on that ride at Lubit. Where was it? Yes. Yeah, Amazon, I believe. But they also complained, sir. They all said to me, once those big 76mm guns of yours start firing for whatever reason, and they're right below them, they said it had like a shocking effect. It put the fear of God into them, apparently.
Because the gun actually goes into the magazine, and you load onto a rotunda, they go straight up and fire. So it catches all the sound. So we have to load them anyway, so we catch it too.
When you say you were using fishing lights and that vessel which challenged you, can you just explain to me what does that mean?
Okay, you look at what a fishing boat looks like. It's got a construction. It's normally got an open area. The modern ones have got the cabin forward, and it's got certain lights, port lights, starboard lights. So we make it look as if we're longer. And the fishing lights, you've got fishing lights as well. When the ship is fishing, she switches on certain lights. So we have these things made up, and they're different to our normal lights. So anybody who's seen us at night will not recognize us from that. So they're just lights which we connect up in different places, covering different areas.
What will happen if it doesn't work? If your ruse does not work? Are you allowed by the rules to shoot first? Or do you have to wait for the ship to attack you?
No. Every operation, we had rules of conduct, and they were all very, very simple. None of them that I remember whatsoever gave us any right to, because we were there clandestine. It was against the point. We had to avoid detection assiduously. So it's a case of, though, and I'll cover it later, there was one case in which we had to contemplate. So I'll come to that.
Just before I let you now carry on, one guy, he apparently served in the Navy. He had some kind of a thing, how you people work up. Rise and shine, and it's like a little song, melody or something. Can you perhaps tell us about it? I'm not sure he was telling the truth.
It is. Ships, we have bosun's calls, we start, and you also wakey, wakey, rise and shine, heave-o, heave-o, lash up and stow. And people make on words. There used to be a traditional one, but everyone's added to it. There are a number of versions. But it's basically to make sure you're awake and you don't fall asleep again quickly. It's traditional in the Navy. We also have a very shrill bosun's call, and we pipe the wakey, wakey too. So you first get the pipe, then followed by the words. The Royal Navy used to have a bugle, so it travels further.
As the commanding officer, when would you actually tell your crew where you're going or what's happening?
We never told them where we're going. All ships, when you worked up, you had to do a special forces workup. So quite often we used that as the cover for the start of an operation. And they would only know we're going to sea. They'd only know it's a special operation when they either at Donkergat or at sea. We could not risk any contact. So when there was no more telephonic contact, we could do it. In habit, habit is quite an interesting one, which I'll do next. That was a different type of operation. I'll explain you more about how we did it there.
I'm sure there's quite a lot more to come, so let me keep quiet again with this horrible voice. And I'm listening. I'm really finding this fascinating. Thank you.
Okay. About 6 months after Amazon, I'd gone into a refit, and I was due to go for a workup with the Rickies, and I was called in again and told, we're going to have to do another operation. I'm not sure the reasoning behind it, but the strike craft always did operations in pairs, because unlike a submarine, which could, just sinks to the bottom for a bit, we had to have a mate. It was traditional if you're going to go to the coast. Anyway, I was called in, and I don't know if it was the lack of already using a submarine, and I was told I was going to do a reconnaissance operation, but it had to be, because I was going alone, it had to be extremely secretive. I was planning to go down to do my workup anyway, but at the same stage, it was the R20 celebrations in Durban. And this provided a very good cover story for this particular operation. It was planned that, and I think I mentioned this flag behind me, on the 30th of May came down, and the new one came up on the 31st. And the whole plan was the Navy would have a fleet review sail past, led by the President Pretorius and a number of strike craft and other ships. And they would all go up to Richards Bay, where they would exercise. The idea being that they'd do the practice runs and everything, and then they'd sail down in the night and do the thing in front. And I was placed in this parade as well. So I was going to be there. But they insisted I must still go and do my workup. So the plan was that I would go down to Donkergat to do my workup. And the idea was that we'd come back, and the night before the actual parade, we'd just go in, so the chaps would get their white uniforms. And it was arranged that all their wives would bring the uniforms down to the ship, hand them to us, and then that night and the next morning, we'd all be wearing our uniforms. But it was all covered. We're going to sail in time for this big parade in Durban. Uniforms we'd pick up at night, and then we'd go up and come back the next day. In the meantime, the whole plan was that we'd find an OPTEF, a defect on the ship, which meant that we could not sail to come back. And we would then sneak out and go and do our operation. Now, the problem with an operational defect is that you've got to get spares, and to get spares, you've got to hand back other parts. So we had to find some operational defect which was serious enough to mean that I could not even sail to Simonstown. We had to have something which didn't require handing back a part. So we had an elaborate plan in that I would report I had a steering gear failure in my rubbers, the rubbers in my rudder. These are like gaskets. And the only place where the spares were in Durban. So I would send this OPTEF. I couldn't move because I didn't have the rudders now. The oil was leaking. The idea was that the base engineer would arrange, logistics officer would arrange for somebody to fly down with these spares. At the same time, he wasn't actually booked. And he went to the airport, came back to the bumped me from the flight. So all of a sudden, this got delayed. But in the meantime, the decision was then taken that, okay, I'll have to wait there until I'm fixed. So because it was an OPTEF, they forgot to tell the wives. OPTEFs are confidential. So they didn't tell the wives, which is an important little catch in this. In my particular case, somebody mentioned to my wife that my husband's not going to be here because they've got this OPTEF. Didn't tell her what it was, so she at least knew. But at the other end, we did our exercise. The Rickies piled on board, and we set sail. Didn't worry about it. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, on the night in question, a whole lot of wives, about 4 wives or 5 wives, instead of leaving the stuff at the gate to be given to the husbands, insisted on going through. And I wouldn't say browbeat the sentries to allow them to go to the jetty. And at about midnight, the duty officer came across these cars there and wives. They said, "What are you doing here?" And they said, He said, no, your ship's not coming in. We've got nothing planned for it. Because he wasn't he wasn't in the story at all. And this caused a problem, and they were organizing memorial services because we were lost at sea. It was a bit of a faux pas in a way, but we continued up. And that night, on the night of the 30th, in fact, we were actually off of Namib. We launched our boats to the Admiral River mouth. Chaps landed. They climbed up, and the whole idea was they were going to recce the railway yard, fuel farm, and the defences, AA defences on the point to the north of Namib. And the team were quite successful. We were hanging around down south until we discovered that where we had to pick them up, the picking up area was trawlers going through, Russian trawlers. So we had to be very, very careful. But then we got a message that they'd been spotted and they were withdrawing. Instead of coming back to where we were, they were withdrawing a bit further to the south, and they were going to come down. And the boats had moved to pick them up, the little boats as well, to pick them up. And the next thing we heard was that one of the chaps had fallen down the cliff, was injured. And at the same time, we were now waiting to try and pick them up. But we had a problem because there was a massive trawler coming past. So we had to close the coast. Not supposed to get that close, but we closed the coast to keep him some distance away because he's got trawls. And I'll never forget, we lost contact with the boats. As soon as the team came down from the cliffs, we lost contact with them as well. So for some reason, we had no contact. And we realized that this fishing boat was going through our pickup position. He was having fishing lights, I mean, some bright lights as well, illuminating. And up on the bridge, we could actually see the two rubber boats, heading towards this fishing boat. And no matter what we did, we could not warn them. But luckily, they realized what it was at the last minute as they were coming up behind them. They said, these aren't strike craft. They turned around, and we were able to use an infrared to attract their attention. We recovered. So that was also a very interesting operation. The first one, the strike craft alone, it was not a big deal in actual fact, because it was to the north of Namib itself, so well clear of anything. But we then sailed for home. The injured man wasn't badly injured, so we could drop him off at Donkergat, where he was taking the sorted out. And we got home to very irate families. But it was an interesting lesson again.
I've heard that the strike craft would shine infrared spotlight right into the air, and then the special forces boats could pick them up because it stands like a pillar. Is that true?
I don't remember that personally. I know infrared is a source. It's just a light, all-round light. Well, they can pick them up, but I don't know that. That you'll have to ask one of the reccees. That wasn't us. That was the reccees on board.
Okay. Then I've heard that the strike craft as a unit became famous that they would poach the best men from the surface fleet because they were so active. They were the strike force. Is that true? I don't know.
It's partially, we needed people. We were growing. We did try and recruit. Submariners, of course, had priority because they were volunteers all. But the one thing that we didn't have was, first of all, being in Durban was not a prize. Durban was a new base. It was away from there. Most of the people were down here. So it was a move to Durban. A lot of people weren't happy to move to Durban. Secondly, the life on strike craft was a lot less formal than that on the bigger ships. We had no stewards. We didn't change. We wore working dress at sea. If you looked at the cupboard, even I, as the captain of the ship, got a cupboard that you could barely fit your T-shirts into. Everyone was very limited. We did not carry a lot of stuff. So life on board was very limited. Small wardroom. even the captain used to pass the plates on, etc. And it became a joke that if you were a young officer there, you were just a coffee jockey. You just to make the coffee all the time. I even made the coffee. But there was also a lot of fear. They thought that we treated other people, looked down on other people. I don't know why, because we're quite happy to have other people. We were just doing our job. And in the beginning, we had to decommission brand new ships to bring the new ones as they were coming. They were coming faster than we could get people. It's quite interesting. I just mentioned when I was the personnel officer, when the officers used to arrive, or even all technical people as well, or groups, I'd always welcome them. And in the officers at that stage, I'll never forget the one time we had 5 young officers arrive there, and I pulled them into my office, and I welcomed them, and I said, look, I do appreciate that some of you are going to be doing your 4 years in the PF, which means you'll get 3 years out of you, and then you're going to resign and you won't have any more things. So tell me now, because I'm going to plan your careers. If you're career people, I'll get you on the courses to get promotion later, 5, 6 years time, or you get sea time now and make more money. And I had 5 there. I asked the first one, where are you from? And he was from Pinetown. I said, okay, I know him. And he was honest. He said, I want to do my 4 years. And next one was from some all local people. The final one was a youngster from Muizenberg. And I didn't ask him. And when I finished, any questions? He said, yes, sir. Why didn't you ask me? I said to him, your father is a well-known warrant officer in the Navy. You're from Muizenberg, and you're coming to Durban. It's obvious you want to stay here. That's how you suss them out. You had to almost volunteer to come there in a way. In the end, we had to appoint people, but they weren't very happy. But once they were there, it changed, because they could see all of a sudden they were going to get command.
You say it's like a special breed, like the submariners, you had a special type person for the strike craft?
Basically, one could almost see beforehand. I had one officer who came to us, and I once went to him and I said to him, you don't belong here. Why don't you go to submarines? He says, well, I'm finding it difficult as well. I arranged with the submariners. I said, I've got a chapter. Look, we are firing him. It's just that he doesn't seem to be settled here, and he volunteered. He went down there, and that was it. It's a different type of breed. And by the way, there's more than that. I, for example, would hate to be on a mine hunt. I mean, I don't mind going into risk at speed, but when you're plodding in and knowing you can be detonating a mine shortly. In fact, if you look at our history, we lost 2 minesweepers during the last war. And one is all except 1 member killed. Minesweepers go into areas killing machines, like driving a tank into a tank minefield. So they're different types, different blokes for different strokes.
Well, we've come to the end of this episode. There's going to be at least a 1 hour. We're not done yet. The Admiral is still busy talking to us. What a delight it is to speak to the man. Sir, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. What you people don't see is the Admiral had to watch me blow my nose, or trying to, and sniveling in the background, which must have been disconcerting to say the least. But all for a good cause. So next week we will talk about Operation Kerslig and other operations as well. Thank you for the thumbs ups, and until we meet again, God bless.